The concert had ended 6 minutes ago, and Georgiana MacDonald had not yet moved. She sat in the third row from the front, on the left-hand side of the assembly rooms, in a gown of pale gray that had been retrimmed twice and still looked exactly like what it was. Around her, the audience reorganized itself into its natural clusters, the titled women finding their titled companions, the diamond earrings locating the diamond brooches, and the whole glittering social mechanism of Bath reassembling with the efficient pleasure of a machine that had missed doing its work. Georgiana watched it from a careful stillness. She had watched it for 6 months. She had watched it. She had thought about it. She had formed precise and detailed opinions about nearly everyone in this room, and she had not once been asked to share them. She was not expected to share them. She was the Dowager Countess of Ravelstone's Reader Companion, which meant she held shawls and opera programs, and on evenings like this one, the Dowager's second glove when the first was being drawn back on. £40 a year, the security of a roof in the Crescent, and the insecurity of a position that required her opinions to remain entirely her own property. She had kept them private for 6 months. She thought she could keep them private for 6 more. Then Lord Edmund Ashby, the Earl of Ravelstone, sat down in the empty seat beside her, and everything she had carefully arranged inside herself shifted like stones, settling after a long stillness. The Dowager was across the room with Miss Cecily Frome and her father, Mr. Silas Frome. Edmund did not look toward them. He set his hat on the adjacent seat, adjusted his position as though he had always intended to sit here, and said nothing. Georgiana said nothing either. The string quartet was still packing away in the corner. A footman moved past with a tray of syllabub glasses. Someone near the front laughed at something, a bright, artificial sound, and the candles in the nearest chandelier trembled. Edmund turned his head, not to her precisely, to the middle distance that happened to include her. "Miss MacDonald," he said, in the way he said nearly everything, level, contained, the words arriving without surplus. "My lord," she said. He looked away again, and Georgiana thought, with a composure she had spent 6 months perfecting, "Well, that is new." She had come to Ravelstone Hall in July at the recommendation of a Mrs. Colville who had employed her the previous winter in Wiltshire, and found her, as she put it, extraordinarily sensible for a woman of 24. The Dowager Countess had required a companion capable of reading aloud without inflection errors and managing correspondence without grammatical ones. Georgiana was capable of both. She was also capable of forming rapid and thorough judgments of character, though this last qualification had not been mentioned in any letter of introduction. The hall itself was immense in the way that only unhappy houses manage. Too much space, too little warmth. The Dowager occupied 3 receiving rooms and her own suite, held court at meals, and directed the household with a precision that left no room for error or affection. Mrs. Partridge, the housekeeper, had shown Georgiana to a room in the east wing, a small room with adequate light and a fireplace that drew well, and had said, without any change in expression, "His lordship is in residence through September. He keeps to himself." It had been a warning. Georgiana had understood that much. What she had not understood, not for several weeks, was the specific quality of the silence Edmund generated wherever he went. He was not rude. He was scrupulously courteous. He spoke when addressed, and answered every question put to him with the exact amount of words the question required, and no more. He read in the library. He rode before 7 in the morning. He reviewed estate papers with his steward each Thursday. He had been the 7th Earl of Ravelstone for 4 years, inheriting at 29, and he moved through his own house like a man who had accepted all the obligations of ownership and none of its pleasures. The Dowager watched him with a mother's confidence that was really something slightly harder than confidence, a certainty that she understood the mechanism of him better than he did. She watched Miss Frome, too, though differently. with the appraising patience of a woman who had identified the correct piece and was waiting for the board to arrange itself so she could place it. Georgiana had watched all of this and said nothing. She had 40 pounds a year and a warm room, and the plain knowledge that her opinions, however accurate, were not the currency anyone here was interested in trading. Then Mr. Frome had come to the library. It had been 3 months into her time at the hall. She had been seated at the writing table sorting the dowager's correspondence when Mr. Silas Frome entered without knocking, which told her immediately the sort of man he was. He was a solicitor by training, a landowner by recent aspiration, and his daughter's matrimonial interests by consuming occupation. He was not unkind to look at, but there was a quality of calculation in how he arranged his face that she had learned to distrust on sight. He had set a folded paper on the table in front of her and said, in the friendly voice of a man who considered friendliness a tactic, "Miss MacDonald, I believe you have the dowager's ear in a way that few companions have managed. I would consider it a significant kindness, and a remunerative one, were you to mention to her ladyship that the Frome estate in Wiltshire has been considerably improved in the last year, and that my daughter's dowry has been reviewed upward." Georgiana had looked at the paper. She had not touched it. "You want me to perform intelligence work on behalf of your daughter's marriage prospects," she said. He had adjusted his pleasant expression without quite abandoning it. "I want you to share information." "The information is in the paper." "Yes." "And the remuneration." He named a figure, 20 pounds, half her annual wage, for a conversation with the dowager that she was confident she could have presented as entirely incidental. She had picked up the paper and held it out to him without unfolding it. "I am the dowager's companion," she said, "not her intelligence service, and if I were her intelligence service, I would still not be yours." He took the paper. He left without courtesy, and Georgiana had returned to the correspondence and thought that, in a house where her opinions were worth nothing, this was still the only possible answer. She had not known, when she made that answer, that the door had been opened further than she realized. She had not known that Edmund, crossing from the estate office to the south stair, had paused at that doorway. She had not known that he had heard every word. She went on not knowing it for 3 months more, through the end of summer and the move to Bath, through the concerts and card parties and the dowager's measured campaign to position Miss Frome at the correct proximity to her son at every available gathering. She kept her opinions carefully to herself. She managed the correspondence. She held the shawls. The night before the concert, the dowager had sat across from her in the morning room, while Georgiana read aloud from a novel of no great literary ambition, but of the dowager's preferred kind. When she reached the end of the chapter, the dowager had not asked her to continue. She had looked at Georgiana over the rims of her reading glasses, with the particular expression she employed when she intended to say something as a favor. "You are a clever creature, Miss MacDonald," she said. "Clever enough to understand that cleverness, in a woman in your position, is most useful when it remains unremarked." It was not the first time the dowager had spoken this way. It had simply been the first time she had been so direct about what Georgiana was: a creature, a useful thing, a position. "I understand perfectly, my lady," Georgiana said. The dowager nodded, satisfied, and asked for the next chapter. And so Georgiana had arrived at the assembly rooms the following evening, with 6 months of private opinions sealed very firmly behind her composed and pleasant expression, and had sat in her gray gown in the 3rd row and listened to a program of Haydn and Clementi with the concentrated attention of a woman who has learned that concert music is one of the few pleasures in her life that costs nothing and requires no explanation. She had been managing perfectly well. Then Edmund had sat down. It must be understood, if his behavior over the following fortnight is to make any sense at all, what Edmund had been doing for 6 months prior to the concert. He had been conducting a private study of Georgiana MacDonald with a rigor that he would not, under any circumstances, have acknowledged as personal interest, because it did not feel to him like personal interest. It felt like the same careful assessment of character he applied to his steward's accounts and his solicitor's advice, a precautionary measure, an exercise in judgment. He had watched her manage the dowager's correspondence without complaint. He had watched her deflect the card-party conversations that reached too near her own circumstances with a graceful redirection that was not quite dishonesty and not quite evasion, but something cleverer than either. He had watched her read aloud in the evenings with a quality of attention to the text that suggested she was actually thinking about what she was reading, which distinguished her, in his observation, from every other reader-companion his mother had employed. And he had stood in the library doorway and heard her refuse £20. He had not known, then, what to do with that information. He had filed it in the careful ledger he kept, separately from sentiment, and he had continued his observations. He had continued them through the move to Bath, and through September's card parties, and the insufferable Clementi. The insufferable Clementi had required him to sit somewhere unexpected. He said, at the end of a few minutes in which neither of them spoke, "The second movement was better than the first." "The second movement is almost always better," Georgiana said. "The first is where the composer introduces himself. The second is where he forgets to." Edmund turned his head, looked at her directly for the first time since he had sat down. She had been looking at the musicians' chairs. She did not turn toward him. He said nothing. Across the room, the dowager had not yet noticed the seating arrangement. When she did, she looked away again with the brief expression of a woman who is recalculating without appearing to. After that evening, Edmund began to do a series of things that Georgiana was certain had explanations entirely unrelated to her, because if they had explanations related to her, she could not afford the cost of acting on that belief. He joined her at breakfast twice when the dowager was still in her rooms. He did not manufacture conversation. He read his newspaper, and she read her book. And once, setting the paper down, he said, "You were right about the Haydn. The slow movement." She had not said anything about the Haydn slow movement aloud at the concert. She thought about that for a long time. The dining parlor at the bathhouse was not large. It held a single round table set for 4, a sideboard with a tea urn, and the silver caddy his mother had brought from the hall. 2 windows looking out toward the Crescent Gardens, and a fire kept low from October through April by Mrs. Partridge's exacting standard. There had been 3 breakfasts in the past week, and at each of them the dowager had remained in her rooms on account of a head, and Miss Frome had not yet called on account of the hour, and the table had therefore held only the Earl and the companion, and the pot of chocolate, and the cooling rolls. On the morning of the Haydn remark, Mrs. Partridge had come in to refill the chocolate herself, rather than send Sally, the parlor maid, and she had set the pot down between them, and looked once at Edmund, and once at Georgiana, and once at the fire, and had said, very mildly, "Sally has the laundry below stairs, my lord. I shall keep the pot warm myself, if it pleases you." Edmund said it pleased him perfectly well. Mrs. Partridge withdrew. She closed the door with the particular care of a woman who had been 30 years in service, and who had learned to close doors so that the gentlemen and gentlewomen on the other side of them remembered they were doors. Georgiana had gone on with her book. She had not looked up. Edmund had said the line about the slow movement, and the slow movement had been the second thing said in the room, after Mrs. Partridge's chocolate, and the third had been the small, clean sound of a paper folded in half and set aside. Georgiana had turned a page and read nothing on it. She had reached the end of the chapter at 9:15, and had marked her place and had gone to fetch the dowager's correspondence box from the writing room, and had not, for the rest of the morning, allowed herself to think the word kindness in connection with the Earl's silence, because the word was a door, and she could not afford to open it. The second breakfast, 3 days after, had been similar in shape and different in one small way. There had been a vase of late chrysanthemums on the side table that the housekeeper's niece, who came in twice a week to do flowers, had brought up from the kitchen. The flowers were a rust bronze color, the color of old coins, and they smelt faintly of cold earth. Edmund had looked at them when he came in, and had not remarked on them, and Georgiana had observed that he had looked at them, and had filed the observation alongside the slow movement of the Haydn and the door misses. Partridge had closed with her particular care. Mrs. Hargreave called that same morning, while Georgiana was in the morning room with the dowager, and the call lasted the prescribed 20 minutes. Mrs. Hargreave spoke at length about the carriage that had thrown a wheel in Milsom Street the previous Thursday, and at slightly less length about Lady Carteret's youngest daughter, who had been engaged and was now no longer engaged. And the dowager listened and made the sounds that civility required, and from time to time looked across at Georgiana with the brief expression of a woman taking inventory of furniture. When Mrs. Hargreave rose to leave, she said, in the tone women used in that drawing-room when they wanted a thing both noticed and deniable, "Lady Ravelstone, you are fortunate in your companion. So few young women now know how to read a room without filling it." The dowager had inclined her head. Georgiana had risen and curtsied and held the door. Mrs. Hargreave had passed through it without looking at her. The door had closed. The dowager had turned back to her embroidery and said, without raising her eyes, "Mrs. Hargreave is observant. One must be careful not to be too observable." Georgiana had said, "Yes, my lady." She had said it in the same tone she said, "Yes, my lady," to everything. And she had returned to the writing table, and she had thought about chrysanthemums the color of old coins, and about a slow movement at a concert, and about a door closed with particular care, and she had not, for the rest of the day, allowed herself to think the word safety, because that door, too, was one she could not afford to open. He arranged to be in the downstairs hall when she returned from the lending library on a Tuesday afternoon in October, rain-damp, and carrying a stack of 3 volumes that were almost too heavy for her to manage comfortably. He took 2 of them without asking. He carried them to the morning-room table and set them down and said, "Miss MacDonald?" as though he had just used her name to test whether it still sounded the same, and then he left. She stood beside the morning-room table and thought, "I cannot. I simply cannot." Then Mr. Silas Frome presented the paper. He did it in the drawing-room after tea, in front of the dowager, with the pleasant efficiency of a man who had timed his moment carefully. It was a contract of understanding, he explained, not a legal document, but a statement of intent, outlining the terms of an arrangement between the Frome family and the House of Ravelstone with respect to the forthcoming season and the question of his daughter's hand. He had drafted it in consultation with the dowager. He presented it to Edmund across the teacups with the confidence of a man who had already won. Edmund looked at the paper for a moment. Then he looked at his mother. "You drafted this," he said. "I indicated my wishes," the dowager said. "Mr. Frome was kind enough to render them legible." Something moved in Edmund's face that Georgiana, seated at the writing table in the corner, with a piece of correspondence she was no longer reading, recognized as rage being placed very firmly under lock. His jaw tightened. The skin at the corner of his eye tightened. He said, in a voice that had gone quieter rather than louder, "Miss MacDonald." She raised her eyes. "Please leave us." It was the kind of request that was not one. She left. In the corridor outside she heard nothing. because the drawing-room doors were solid and the house was well built. But she understood from the duration of what followed that something was being negotiated at a cost that was real and present, and not yet resolved. She heard about the wound from Mrs. Partridge. Not directly. Not in the way of gossip. She had gone to Mrs. Partridge 2 days after the drawing-room scene to ask about a letter that had gone astray in the post, and Mrs. Partridge had answered the letter question and then looked at her with the steady gray eyes of a woman who had been in this house for 30 years and had learned to take the measure of people quickly. They were standing in the small linen press at the back of the upper landing, where Mrs. Partridge counted and folded the household linen on Tuesday afternoons, and where the housekeeper kept a chair by the window for the kind of conversation that did not belong in a parlor. The chair was a plain rush-bottomed thing with a cushion in faded green. The window faced the lane behind the house and the kitchen yard, where 2 cats from the stable kept the mice down in summer and gave the kitchen maid a quiet enmity in winter. Mrs. Partridge had set the linen on the press and folded a cloth across her arm and gestured Georgiana toward the chair. Georgiana had sat. She had observed the gesture and had taken it as the small ceremony it was. "You've been good to this household, Miss MacDonald," Mrs. Partridge said. "Better than most companions, and they've had a number." "I am glad to be useful," Georgiana said. "It's not usefulness, I mean." Mrs. Partridge folded a linen cloth over her arm. His lordship had a ward, a boy called Thomas, 9 years old when he died, 3 years ago now. Fever. His lordship was in London and did not come back quickly enough, and when he did come back, he did not send for a second physician because he trusted his own judgment about what the boy needed. She paused. She looked at the linen on the press, which was already neat, and adjusted a corner that did not require adjustment. He no longer trusts his own judgment about what the people in his care need. You may have noticed. Georgiana had noticed. She had not known the name. Thomas. "He kept the boy's portrait in the library at the hall," Mrs. Partridge said. The cloth was already folded. She did not unfold it. "Turned to the wall, these 3 years, the other side facing the fire. I have not been permitted to turn it round, and I have not asked to be." She looked at Georgiana then. "I am telling you this, because the man you have been sitting opposite at breakfast is not the man I have known these 11 years, and the difference is not something I can explain to him, but it is something I would like someone to know." Georgiana had said, "Mrs. Partridge, why are you telling me?" Mrs. Partridge had taken up the linen and set it back on the press with the small care of a person who had never wasted a fold. "Because you refused Mr. Frome £20 in a library 3 months ago, Miss MacDonald, and I was on the other side of the window with the curtain rings, and I have not forgotten it, and neither, I believe, has his lordship." She paused. "I am telling you because I should like you to know what manner of thing you stepped into when you took the position, and what manner of thing you may yet step out of, if you choose to." Georgiana had looked at the cushion on the chair, the faded green, the worn place where someone's hand had rested over many seasons. She had said, "Thank you, Mrs. Partridge." Mrs. Partridge had said, "I have not done anything to be thanked for. I have folded the linen. Good day to you, Miss MacDonald." She had not curtsied on account of being indoors and senior in the house, and Georgiana had risen from the chair with a small inclination that the housekeeper acknowledged with the slightest nod, the kind exchanged between 2 women who understood the precise weight of a private word carried in a linen room. She had thought about a man who had been 30 years old and certain of his own judgment, and had come home from London to find that his certainty had been wrong in a way that could not be corrected. She thought about 6 months of cold, careful distance, and what it might actually be armor over, rather than character. She thought, oh. She went on thinking it for several weeks, and managed barely to keep it to herself. The garden confrontation arrived not because she chose it, but because the garden was the one place in the bathhouse where the dowager could not reasonably follow her on a cold November afternoon. Edmund was already there, standing at the low stone wall with his back to the gate, looking at the bare rose beds that no one had bothered to prepare for winter. She went in. The gate clicked behind her. He turned. She thought, I cannot. And then, 6 months. 6 months is long enough to be certain. My lord, she said, I should like to say something that I have been considering for some time, and I ask that you permit me to finish it before you answer. He looked at her. He did not tell her to proceed. He did not tell her to stop. He simply waited. Which was, she had come to understand, his version of permission. I have held opinions about you since July, she said. I have kept them. Because I had no right to express them. And because the dowager's position was quite clear regarding the usefulness of my cleverness. And because £40 a year is not a thing one sacrifices for honesty without very careful thought. She drew a breath. The cold air hurt a little, going in. I think you are a man who made one error in judgment that cost you something irreplaceable, and you have decided, as a consequence, that your judgment is not to be trusted. I think you are wrong about that. I think your judgment is precise, and I think you are afraid of it. Which is a very different problem. I think Mr. Frome's paper is designed to make a decision for you because your mother believes you have lost the capacity to make one for yourself. I do not believe that. I think you have the capacity for it, and I think you are simply waiting for something to make it safe. She stopped. The rose beds were very bare. Somewhere above the garden wall, a starling said something unrepeatable. I think, she said more quietly, that I have spent 6 months forming opinions in a house where I was not permitted to have them, and that I would rather lose the position than spend another 6 months in the same arrangement. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. His face had done nothing obvious. The cold air was quite equal between them. Miss MacDonald, he said. She waited. He said, Go inside. You will be chilled. She went inside. That was the dark moment, though she did not see it as such until 2 days later, when the dowager engineered the ball. The ball at the upper rooms was the grandest event of the autumn season in Bath, approximately 140 guests, the chandeliers lit in their full number, and the dowager at her most ceremonial. She had arranged Georgiana as she always arranged her at such events, at the margin of the principal rooms, available to fetch and to hold and to manage, visible enough to be of use, and placed far enough from the central groupings to be understood as furniture rather than guest. The second voicing of the label had come 3 days prior, in the drawing-room before Miss Frome's morning call. The dowager had mentioned, with a pleasant clarity that left no interpretation available, that Georgiana was a sensible creature and would understand that sensible creatures in her position did not mistake courtesy for elevation. The third voicing came at the ball. The dowager had waited until the room was at its fullest and its attention most general. And then she had done it simply and efficiently. She had said to Mrs. Hargreave and the 2 other women of her immediate circle, loudly enough to carry, Miss MacDonald is wonderfully diligent. One could not ask for a more capable creature. Of course she has no real understanding of these rooms beyond the service she performs in them. It landed in a small radius and spread outward, the way such things do. Georgiana heard it from 6 feet away. She stood in the exact center of a room containing 140 people, in her gray gown, with the dowager's second fan in her left hand, and she felt the particular quality of exposure that comes from being reduced in public by someone with the social authority to make the reduction stick. The nearby guests were doing the thing guests do in such moments. They were looking away from the point of discomfort with the careful deliberateness of people who have chosen, actively, not to intervene. She thought, £40 a year, and a warm room and 6 months of holding opinions that belonged to no one. She thought, Thomas. She thought, Edmund told her to go inside. Then she stopped thinking and spoke. She turned to the dowager and she said, without raising her voice, without cruelty, in the clear carrying tone she had developed from 6 months of reading aloud, My lady, I believe you are mistaken about what I understand and do not understand. I have been present in these rooms for 6 months, and I have used that time rather more carefully than you may be aware. I know, for instance, that Thomas was 9 years old, and that the grief of that is the only honest thing in this house that no one has been permitted to name. The dowager's fan stopped moving. The nearby guests had the specific stillness of people who have turned back toward the point of discomfort, having discovered that looking away is no longer possible. Then 3 strides crossed the ballroom. Edmund arrived at Georgiana's left side. He had come from the far end of the room, past the orchestra, past the column of light nearest the door, past Mrs. Hargreave and her circle, and he had made no particular ceremony of the crossing and no particular speed, and yet every person in the radius of 30 feet was watching him when he arrived. He looked at Georgiana. He said, in the level voice he used for things he had decided, Miss MacDonald, I have been intending to ask you something for some time. The room was waiting. The orchestra had reached the end of a phrase and was negotiating the start of the next one, and in the gap between them there was approximately nothing. I should like you to marry me, he said. On the grounds that your judgment is more precise than mine, your opinions are better than I deserve to hear, and you told Mr. Frome to take his paper elsewhere when £20 would have made a very material difference to £40 a year. I am aware that these are not conventional grounds. They are, however, the accurate ones. Georgiana looked at him. She said, after a moment, That is a very particular kind of proposal, my lord. I am a very particular kind of person, he said. As you have pointed out, something happened, very briefly, in her face. The 6 months of careful stillness, the gray gown trimmed twice, the £40, the creature, the useful thing, the opinions belonging to no one. It all stood in her chest for one moment and then released, not noisily, not with any declaration, but in the way that a window opens when the latch has been lifted and the pressure on both sides is finally equal. Yes, she said. I will. Miss Frome, at the dowager's side, understood her displacement with a clarity that was not unkind to witness. She had been the correct piece on the board, correctly positioned, and the board had simply arranged itself differently. She looked at her father with the expression of a young woman recalculating her season, and Mr. Frome, for his part, had the specific quietness of a man who has remembered that a forced contract paper with no binding legal weight carries very little authority when the Earl in question has made his own choice in front of 140 witnesses. The dowager did not speak. She looked at Edmund, then she looked at Georgiana. Something moved in her face that was not the certainty she had arrived with. Something smaller and less comfortable, the recognition of a woman who has spent 30 years protecting a mechanism and has just watched the mechanism proceed without her. She inclined her head slightly, and then she turned and accepted Mrs. Hargreave's arm and walked toward the far end of the room. And that was the end of it. The weeks that followed did not resolve into anything simple. Nothing in Ravelstone ever resolved simply. Edmund was courteous to her in the way that indicated he was learning to be something less contained, which was not quick work. And Georgiana was patient in the way that indicated she understood the specific nature of what she was waiting for, which required its own kind of discipline. The dowager was present at meals and formal in her civility, which was, given what civility had cost her, a reasonable settlement. Miss Frome and her father had returned to Wiltshire by the second week of December. They were married in Bath before Christmas, by the parish vicar, in the small church on the corner of the square, with Mrs. Partridge as one of 3 witnesses, and the solicitor of record as the second, and the whole business conducted with a quiet efficiency that suited them both considerably better than a large ceremony would have. Georgiana wore a gown of deep ivory wool that the dressmaker had finished 2 days prior, and which was the first thing she had ever owned that had not been retrimmed from something else. Edmund wore his best coat and looked at her when she arrived at the church door with the expression of a man who has finally made a decision he trusts. They came back to Ravelstone Hall for the first days of the new year, when the estate had settled into its winter quiet, and the fields were blank and white, and the house was warm in the particular way of houses that have been prepared for someone's return. Mrs. Partridge met them in the entrance hall. She curtsied. She looked at Georgiana with the steady gray eyes of a woman who has been calculating the right moment for 30 years. "My lady," she said. 2 words. Georgiana had known they were coming. She had known since the church. They still required a moment. That evening the fire was lit in the library, and the snow outside the library window was a soft, consistent white that reduced the garden and the lane, and the bare rose beds to a clean quiet. Georgiana sat in the chair nearest the fire with a cup of tea and a novel she was not reading. Edmund sat across from her with the estate papers he was reviewing, which was, she had come to understand, his version of contentment. On the wall to the left of the fireplace, turned now to face the room, was the portrait. Oval-framed, small, a child of perhaps 7 in the painting, which meant it had been done 2 years before. Thomas had brown eyes, and his mouth had been caught in a position that was almost smiling, the way children's mouths are in portraits when they are trying to sit still and nearly managing it. Edmund looked up from the estate papers. He looked at the portrait for a moment. Then he looked at Georgiana. He was very fond of the library, he said. He used to take books from the lower shelves and arrange them by color, which drove the housekeeper quite mad. Georgiana looked at the portrait. What was his favorite color? Blue, Edmund said. All the Haydn volumes. She looked at him. He looked at the portrait again. And something in his face had settled into a quality she could not quite name. Not peace, exactly, and not absolution, but something closer to the ability to speak the name in a room without the room requiring him to be unmoved by it. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall on the bare rose beds, and the stone wall and the lane that led from Ravelstone to the road to Bath, and the candle on the writing table burned with a steady, unconcerned flame, and Georgiana MacDonald, who had held 6 months of careful opinions about a man she had never been permitted to address as an equal, set down her cup and thought, "Here, this is it. This is the room where my opinions belong." She had been right about his judgment. If Georgiana's story stayed with you, leave a word or 2 in the comments about the moment that found you. These stories take time and care to tell, and every note from you is the reason there are more of them.